Sarah Martinez wiped down the same table for the third time in 10 minutes, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the rain streak down the windows of Murphy's Diner. The small-town restaurant sat on the edge of Millbrook, Colorado, population 2,847, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. But Sarah had been keeping the biggest secret of all for 3 years now. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, shaking the November rain from his jacket. Sarah forced her practiced smile, the one that had earned her the title of sweetest waitress in town, according to the local newspaper. Nobody in Millbrook knew that same smile had once been used to infiltrate a terrorist cell in Damascus, or that those steady hands pouring coffee had assembled explosives that saved 43 hostages. "Coffee, hun?" she asked the newcomer, a traveling salesman by the look of his rumpled suit and tired eyes. Her voice carried the slight Colorado accent she'd perfected over the years, burying any trace of the 4 languages she spoke fluently or the years of training that had shaped her into one of the CIA's most effective deep-cover operatives. The man nodded, settling into booth 7, the same booth where old Pete Morrison had been sitting every morning for 12 years until his heart attack last spring. Sarah poured the coffee, nodding automatically that the stranger's shoes were too clean for a man who claimed to be driving cross-country, and his hands showed no signs of manual labor despite his blue-collar appearance. But she pushed down the instincts that had kept her alive in places most people couldn't pronounce. She wasn't Agent Sarah Chen anymore. She was just Sarah Martinez, waitress, whose biggest worry was supposed to be whether the coffee maker would last another winter. Diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd. Farmer Joe complained about the weather while his wife Mary rolled her eyes and ordered her usual wheat toast. Principal Henderson discussed the upcoming high school football playoffs with Coach Roberts. Mrs. Patterson, the town librarian, sat in her corner booth gradding what looked like book reports. Normal people living normal lives in a normal town where the most exciting event in recent memory had been the new traffic light installation on Main Street. Sarah refilled coffee cups and took orders, her movements automatic after 3 years of practice. She'd chosen this life deliberately, the anonymity, the routine, the safety of being invisible. After what happened in Prague, after she'd been burned and her entire network compromised, the agency had offered her a new identity and a quiet place to disappear. Millbrook had seemed perfect, the kind of place where a woman could fade into the background and never be found. The kitchen timer rang, and Sarah hurried to collect the breakfast orders. As she balanced 3 plates on her arms with the skill that came from countless hours of practice, she caught a glimpse of herself in the coffee pot's reflection. Brown hair instead of the black she'd been born with, brown contacts hiding her natural green eyes, and 20 pounds heavier than her operational weight. Even her own mother wouldn't recognize her now, though her mother had been dead for 15 years. "Order up for table 4, called Miguel, the cook who'd become the closest thing she had to a friend in Millbrook. He was a good man, divorced, with 2 kids he saw on weekends. Sometimes Sarah wondered what it would be like to have that kind of normal relationship, but she'd learned long ago that people like her didn't get happy endings. The breakfast rush continued, and Sarah fell into the rhythm that had become her life. Pour coffee, take orders, smile, make small talk about the weather or the local high school team. She'd become genuinely fond of many of the regulars, Mrs. Chen, who always left exactly 15% tip, and asked about her arthritis, young Tommy Morrison, who stopped by every morning before his construction job and always ordered 2 glazed donuts and black coffee. But even as she performed her role, part of her mind remained alert, cataloging exits and potential threats out of habit. The training never really left, no matter how much she wanted it to. She'd been Sarah Martinez for 3 years, but Agent Sarah Chen still lived somewhere deep inside, dormant but not dead. The stranger in booth 7 ordered the full breakfast special, but barely touched his food, spending more time watching the other customers than eating. Sarah made mental notes automatically, left-handed despite the right-handed watch, slight bulge under his left armpit, suggesting a shoulder holster, eyes that moved too systematically to belong to a casual traveler. Every instinct she'd spent 3 years suppressing suddenly roared to life. When she brought his check, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to see too much. "Nice quiet town," he said, his voice carrying no particular accent but somehow lacking the regional markers that would make it authentic. "We like it that way," Sarah replied, keeping her voice light and friendly while her heart rate accelerated. "Will you be staying long?" "Just passing through," he said, leaving a $20 bill for a $12 meal. "But I might be back." After he left, Sarah found herself checking the locks and windows more carefully than usual. The rain had stopped, but dark clouds still gathered on the horizon. She tried to tell herself she was being paranoid, that 3 years of peaceful routine had made her jumpy. But experience had taught her that paranoia was often just good sense wearing a different name. The afternoon shift brought different customers: teenagers from the high school, mothers with young children, retirees looking for somewhere to pass the time. Sarah served them all with the same practiced smile, but her mind kept returning to the stranger and the feeling that her carefully constructed world might be about to change. As evening approached and the dinner crowd began to filter in, Sarah noticed another unfamiliar face. This one was easier to place: a woman in her 30s, professionally dressed but trying too hard to look casual. She ordered a salad and spent the entire meal typing on her phone, occasionally glancing up to scan the room. Two strangers in one day might be coincidence in a larger town, but in Millbrook, it was cause for concern. The woman paid with cash and left without finishing her meal, but not before making what looked like a phone call from the parking lot. Sarah watched through the window as she spoke intensely for several minutes before driving away in a rental car with out-of-state plates. By the time Sarah's shift ended at 9 o'clock, she'd counted 4 more unfamiliar faces among the dinner crowd. All of them shared certain characteristics: too observant, too careful, too interested in everyone except her. It was exactly the kind of surveillance pattern she'd been trained to recognize, the type used when a team was gathering intelligence before making a move. Walking to her car in the employee parking lot behind the diner, Sarah felt the weight of 3 peaceful years pressing down on her shoulders. She'd almost believed she could stay hidden forever, could live the quiet life of a small-town waitress until she grew old and died of something ordinary like heart disease or cancer. But as she drove home through Millbrook's empty streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was finally catching up with her. Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom above the hardware store, chosen specifically for its multiple exit routes and clear sightlines in all directions. She'd told her landlord she liked the natural light, but the truth was she'd selected it for the same reasons she'd chosen everything else in her new life: security over comfort, function over form. That night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of Millbrook settling into sleep, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. She reached under her mattress and retrieved the go-bag she'd hoped never to use again. Inside were 3 different passports, $50,000 in cash, a secure satellite phone, and a Glock 19 that she cleaned and maintained monthly despite praying she'd never need it. She didn't activate the phone or pack the bag, not yet. But for the first time in 3 years, Agent Sarah Chen stirred fully awake inside the shell of Sarah Martinez, Waitress. And despite the fear that came with that awakening, there was also something else, a sense of purpose she'd almost forgotten existed. Tomorrow she would go back to Murphy's Diner, pour coffee and take orders, and smile at the regular customers who'd become the closest thing to family she'd known in years. But she would also be watching, analyzing, preparing for the possibility that her quiet life in Millbrook was about to become very complicated indeed. Outside her window, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened up, and rain began to fall in earnest on the quiet streets of the town that had given her 3 years of peace. Sarah listened to the sound and wondered if she would ever hear it again. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with frost coating the windows of Murphy's Diner like a warning. Sarah arrived for her shift 30 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct the kind of security sweep she hadn't performed in 3 years. She checked the usual hiding spots for surveillance devices, examined the locks for signs of tampering, and tested the back exit route she'd memorized on her first day of work. Everything appeared normal, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified overnight. As she tied her apron and started the first pot of coffee, Sarah's enhanced senses picked up subtle changes in the diner's atmosphere. The usual sounds seemed muffled, conversations carried differently, and even the familiar smell of bacon grease seemed sharper somehow. Miguel arrived just after 6, grumbling about the cold as he fired up the grill. "Morning, Sarah. You look tired. Everything okay?" "Just couldn't sleep," she replied, forcing normalcy into her voice while her eyes automatically scanned the parking lot through the kitchen window. "Storm kept me up." But it hadn't been the storm. Sarah had spent most of the night conducting counter-surveillance from her apartment window, documenting license plates and noting the subtle changes in Millbrook's usual nighttime patterns. 3 different vehicles had made slow passes down her street between midnight and dawn, professionally executed reconnaissance that confirmed her worst fears. The morning regulars began filtering in right on schedule. Farmer Joe and Mary took their usual booth, Principal Henderson grabbed his coffee to go, and Mrs. Patterson settled into her corner with a stack of papers. But their familiar presence only highlighted the strangers who came with them. The first was a man in his 40s wearing the kind of casual outdoor gear that screamed federal agent trying to blend in with locals. He ordered coffee and eggs, but spent more time studying the diner's layout than eating his breakfast. Sarah noted the way he positioned himself to watch both the front door and the kitchen entrance, and the telltale bulge of body armor under his flannel shirt. 20 minutes later, a woman entered wearing running clothes and acting like she'd just finished exercising. But her breathing was too controlled for someone who'd been jogging, and her athletic shoes were too clean for Colorado's muddy November streets. She ordered a protein shake that Miguel had to improvise, then spent 45 minutes making it last while typing on her phone. By mid-morning, Sarah had counted 6 obvious surveillance operatives distributed throughout the diner and parking lot. They were good, better than the usual FBI surveillance teams she'd encountered during her operational years. But they were still operating under the assumption that they were watching a retired waitress, not someone trained to spot exactly this kind of operation. The realization hit her like cold water. They weren't here to arrest her. If this were a federal takedown, they would have surrounded her apartment in the pre-dawn hours and extracted her quietly. This was something else entirely, a complex surveillance operation designed to monitor her activities while keeping her in place. Someone wanted to see who she contacted, where she went, what she did when she thought she was safe. Which meant they either suspected she had intelligence they needed, or they were using her as bait to catch someone else. Sarah continued her shift with mechanical precision, serving coffee and taking orders while her mind raced through possibilities. Had her former CIA handlers discovered her location? Was a foreign intelligence service finally closing in after 3 years of searching? Or had someone from her past life followed a trail she thought she'd erased completely? The answer came during the lunch rush in the form of a familiar face that made her blood run cold. Victor Petrov entered Murphy's diner at exactly 12:47 p.m., wearing an expensive suit that looked ridiculously out of place among the farmers and small-town workers. Sarah recognized him immediately despite the years that had passed, the Russian intelligence officer who'd been hunting her since the Prague operation went sideways. The man whose entire network she'd dismantled in a single night, costing him his career and nearly his life. He took a seat at the counter and smiled at her with the same predatory expression she remembered from their encounters in Eastern Europe. "I would like coffee, please," he said in accented English, his voice carrying undertones that only she would recognize. "And perhaps you could recommend something local." Sarah's hand remained steady as she poured his coffee, though every nerve in her body screamed danger. "The pie's good," she said, her Colorado accent intact despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Made it myself this morning." "Ah, a woman of many talents," Victor replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "I am sure there is much about you that would surprise people." The conversation continued in this coded dance for several minutes, with Victor making seemingly innocent comments about the town, the weather, and the quality of American diners while actually conveying a very different message. He knew who she was, he knew where she'd been hiding, and he was here for revenge 3 years in the making. But something else was happening too. Sarah noticed the surveillance operative's shifting position as soon as Victor entered. The federal agent in outdoor gear moved closer to the counter. The woman in running clothes positioned herself to watch the parking lot, and at least 2 other operatives she'd spotted earlier converged on locations that would give them clear fields of fire if needed. They weren't watching her anymore, they were watching Victor. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with terrifying clarity. The CIA hadn't sent these people to capture her, they'd sent them to protect her. Someone in the intelligence community had learned that Victor was closing in on her location and had deployed a protective surveillance team to Millbrook. They were using her as bait, but they were also prepared to intervene if necessary. Which meant her former handlers knew exactly where she was and had been monitoring her all along. Victor finished his coffee and left a generous tip, his message delivered. As he walked toward the door, he paused next to her and spoke quietly in Russian. "It has been a long time, Agent Chen. We have much to discuss." Then he was gone, leaving Sarah standing behind the counter with her mind reeling from the implications. The careful life she'd built in Millbrook, the 3 years of peaceful anonymity, it had all been an illusion. She'd never truly escaped her past. She'd simply been allowed to think she had. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. The surveillance operatives maintained their positions, but Sarah could see the tension in their postures, the way they checked their communications equipment more frequently. Victor's appearance had changed the dynamic completely, escalating what had been a monitoring operation into something much more dangerous. As her shift neared its end, Sarah made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything she could imagine. She slipped into the diner's small office during a quiet moment and used the landline to dial a number she'd memorized but never expected to use. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Director Richardson." "Nightingale Protocol," Sarah said quietly, using the code name that officially no longer existed. "Request immediate extraction." There was a long pause before Richardson responded. "Negative on extraction, Nightingale. Maintain position and await further instructions." "Sir, my cover is blown. Viktor Petrov made direct contact less than 2 hours ago." "We know. That's why you need to stay exactly where you are." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone in her hand. For the first time since Prague, she felt truly alone. The agency she'd served faithfully for 12 years was using her as a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and the man who'd sworn to kill her was somewhere in Millbrook planning his next move. That evening, as Sarah prepared to close the diner, she noticed the surveillance team subtly shifting their positions again. Instead of watching for threats, they were boxing her in, making sure she couldn't leave without being observed. The protection had become containment, and she realized with growing horror that she might be more prisoner than asset. The last customer left at 9:30, and Sarah began her closing routine with mechanical precision. But as she wiped down tables and counted the till, she was actually conducting a detailed assessment of her tactical situation. The surveillance team had at least 8 operatives that she could identify, positioned to cover all possible escape routes from the diner. They were professionals, well-equipped and disciplined. But they were also operating under rules of engagement that limited their options. They couldn't simply grab her without cause, and they couldn't use lethal force unless she presented a clear threat. Victor, on the other hand, operated under no such constraints. As Sarah locked up the diner and walked to her car, she felt eyes on her from multiple directions. The protective surveillance followed her home, maintaining discreet distances but ensuring she was never alone. They were trying to keep her safe, but they were also keeping her trapped. That night, lying in her bed above the hardware store, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to calculate her odds of surviving whatever was coming next. Viktor Petrov would make his move soon. He wasn't the type to announce his presence and then wait. The CIA team would try to stop him, but their primary concern would be protecting their operation, not protecting her. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah allowed herself to remember who she really was. Not a small-town waitress serving coffee and making small talk, but a highly trained operative who'd survived situations that would have killed most people. The woman who'd infiltrated a terrorist cell in Syria, who'd extracted a defector from Moscow under impossible odds, who dismantled Viktor's entire network in a single night of careful planning and precise execution. Agent Sarah Chen had been dormant for 3 years, but she wasn't dead. And tomorrow, when Viktor made his move, he was going to discover that the frightened waitress he thought he was hunting had claws of her own. Outside her window, Millbrook settled into its usual nighttime quiet, unaware that their peaceful town had become the stage for a confrontation 3 years in the making. Sarah closed her eyes and began planning for war. Dawn broke over Millbrook with an eerie stillness that made Sarah's skin crawl. She'd spent the night preparing for what she knew was coming, checking and rechecking her weapons, studying escape routes, and mentally rehearsing scenarios she'd hoped never to face again. The go bag sat ready by her door, but she wasn't planning to run. Not this time. The morning shift at Murphy's Diner felt like walking onto a stage where everyone knew their roles except her. The surveillance operatives were still in position, but their body language had changed overnight. Where before they'd been watchful but relaxed, now they moved with the coiled tension of people expecting violence. Sarah went through her opening routine with mechanical precision, but her senses were hyperalert to every sound, every movement, every change in the atmosphere around her. The coffee maker's gurgle sounded unnaturally loud. The sizzle of bacon on Miguel's grill seemed sharper than usual, and even the familiar creak of the diner's old floorboards carried new meaning. Miguel noticed her tension immediately. "You okay this morning, Sarah? You seem on edge." "Just didn't sleep well," she replied, checking the locks on the back door for the third time. "Maybe coming down with something." But what she was coming down with wasn't a cold. It was the realization that 3 years of peace were about to end in violence, and innocent people were going to get caught in the crossfire. The thought of Farmer Joe or Mrs. Patterson being hurt because of her past made her stomach twist with guilt. The morning regulars arrived on schedule, blissfully unaware that their favorite diner had become ground zero for an international intelligence operation. Principal Henderson chatted about the upcoming Christmas pageant while Sarah poured his coffee, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Mrs. Patterson complained about the cold weather while Sarah mentally cataloged every exit and potential weapon within reach. At exactly 10:15 a.m., everything changed. A black SUV pulled into the diner's parking lot, moving too slowly to be casual but not fast enough to be aggressive. Sarah recognized the tactic immediately, a probe to test reactions and gather last-minute intelligence. Through the window, she could see the surveillance team adjusting their positions, speaking rapidly into concealed microphones. The SUV's occupants didn't exit immediately. Instead, they sat and observed, letting the tension build while they assessed the tactical situation. Sarah continued serving customers as if nothing was happening, but every nerve in her body was screaming danger. 20 minutes later, Viktor Petrov walked through the front door. He wasn't alone this time. 2 men flanked him, a professional muscle with the kind of expensive suits and expensive training that marked them as high-level private security. They moved with the fluid coordination of a team that had worked together for years, automatically positioning themselves to control the dining room while Victor approached the counter. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his accented English carrying just enough volume to be overheard by nearby customers. "I was hoping we could continue our conversation from yesterday." The surveillance operatives were moving now. Sarah could see them through her peripheral vision. The federal agent in outdoor gear stood up from his booth, his hand moving toward his concealed weapon. The woman in running clothes had positioned herself near the door, blocking the most obvious exit route. But something else was happening that made Sarah's blood run cold. Victor's men weren't watching the surveillance team. They were watching the customers. Regular people who had no idea they were about to become hostages in a confrontation 3 years in the making. "I'm working," Sarah replied calmly, her trained voice betraying nothing of the calculations racing through her mind. "Maybe you could come back later." Victor smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I think now would be better. You see, I have been waiting a very long time for this conversation." The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Farmer Joe looked up from his newspaper, sensing something wrong but not understanding what. Mary reached for her purse with the instinctive reaction of someone who'd lived through hard times. Principal Henderson glanced between Victor and Sarah, clearly picking up on the tension but unsure what to do about it. Sarah made her decision in that instant. She couldn't let innocent people get hurt because of her past. Whatever Victor wanted, whatever game the CIA was playing, it ended here and now. "Miguel," she called to the kitchen, her voice carrying a coded urgency he wouldn't understand but might respond to anyway. "Could you check the freezer? I think something might be wrong with the temperature." Miguel emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "What's the problem?" "Nothing you can't handle," Sarah replied, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him take a step back. "Just stay in the kitchen for a while, okay?" Understanding flickered across Miguel's face, not the details, but enough to recognize serious trouble. He nodded and retreated toward the back of the diner, hopefully toward the rear exit Sarah had made sure he knew about. Victor watched this exchange with amusement. "Very considerate of you, but I am afraid it will not be so simple." He gestured slightly, and his men moved into flanking positions. The message was clear: nobody was leaving until he got what he came for. The surveillance team's response was immediate and professional. The federal agent stepped forward, his badge visible in his left hand while his right remained near his weapon. "Federal agents, everyone remain calm and stay seated." But Victor had been expecting this. Ah, the famous American law enforcement, so predictable. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but felt like hours to Sarah's combat-trained perception. Victor's men moved with practiced efficiency, drawing weapons that had somehow passed through whatever screening the surveillance team had established. The customers screamed and dove for cover as the peaceful morning exploded into chaos. Sarah was already moving before the first shot was fired. Years of muscle memory kicked in as she vaulted over the counter, using the cash register as cover while she assessed the tactical situation. Victor had positioned himself behind the booth where Farmer Joe and Mary were cowering, using them as human shields while his men engaged the surveillance operatives in a firefight that was rapidly destroying the diner she'd called home for 3 years. The federal agent returned fire from behind an overturned table, his shots precise and controlled. The woman in running clothes had drawn her own weapon and was trying to maneuver for a clear shot at Victor's men while keeping the customers out of the line of fire. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, fighting a defensive battle in close quarters with innocent lives at stake. Sarah reached under the counter where she'd hidden her Glock 3 years ago, wrapped in plastic and taped to the underside of the cash drawer. Her fingers found the familiar grip, and Agent Sarah Chen fully awakened for the first time since Prague. The first target was Victor's man on the left, who had Principal Henderson trapped in the corner and was using him as cover while firing at the surveillance team. Sarah's shot took him center mass, the Glock's bark echoing through the diner as he dropped to the floor. Victor spun toward her, his own weapon appearing in his hand with professional speed. There she is, the real Sarah Chen. Let them go, Victor, Sarah called out, her weapon trained on his center mass despite the human shields between them. This is between us. Yes, it is, he agreed. You destroyed my life, killed my men, ended my career, and then you disappeared like a coward. The second gunman was advancing on the surveillance operatives, forcing them to divide their attention between protecting themselves and protecting the civilians. Sarah couldn't get a clear shot without endangering Mrs. Patterson, who was trapped between the shooter and the wall. That's when the unexpected happened. The front door exploded inward as 4 men in full tactical gear breached the entrance with military precision. But these weren't more CIA operatives or local law enforcement. The gear was wrong, the tactics too aggressive, and the weapons too advanced for a domestic operation. Navy SEALs. Sarah recognized the signs immediately: the fluid movement, the overwhelming firepower, the surgical precision with which they neutralized threats while avoiding civilian casualties. Victor's remaining gunman was down before he could react, taken out by a perfectly placed shot that dropped him without endangering Mrs. Patterson. But the SEALs weren't here for Victor either. They were moving directly towards Sarah with the kind of purposeful advance that meant they had specific orders regarding her. Sarah Chen, the team leader called out, his voice muffled by tactical gear but carrying absolute authority. We need you to come with us, now. Victor's expression shifted from triumph to confusion to rage in the space of seconds. Whatever he'd planned, whatever game he thought he was playing, the arrival of a Navy SEAL team had just changed all the rules. This is not over, Victor snarled, but he was already moving toward the back exit, his carefully planned operation crumbling around him. The lead SEAL took 3 steps toward Sarah, then stopped. His next words changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. Agent Chen, you're being reactivated. There's a situation that requires your specific skill set, and we're running out of time. Sarah kept her weapon ready but lowered it slightly. I'm retired. Not anymore. He gestured toward Victor's retreating form. That's just the beginning. There's something much bigger coming, and you're the only one who can stop it. As sirens wailed in the distance, and the diner filled with smoke from the gunfight, Sarah looked around at the destruction of the peaceful life she'd built. Farmer Joe was helping Mary to her feet, both of them shaken but unharmed. Principal Henderson was checking on Mrs. Patterson, who appeared more angry than frightened. Miguel emerged from the kitchen with a baseball bat in his hands and relief on his face. These people had become her family over the past 3 years, and she'd just brought violence into their world. The guilt of that would stay with her forever, but she also knew that whatever was coming next would be worse than anything Victor could have planned. What kind of situation? She asked the SEAL team leader. The kind that could start a war, he replied, and you're the only one who knows how to prevent it. Sarah holstered her weapon and looked one last time at the ruins of Murphy's diner. Agent Sarah Chen was fully awake now, and there was no going back to sleep. "Then let's go prevent a war," she said. The helicopter lifted off from Millbrook's high school football field just as the first local police cars arrived at Murphy's diner. Sarah watched through the aircraft's window as her carefully constructed life shrank to a collection of small buildings disappearing into the Colorado landscape. 3 years of peace, gone in 20 minutes of violence. The Navy SEAL team leader, who'd introduced himself only as Commander Hayes, handed her a tablet loaded with classified briefings. "You'll want to read this before we arrive at Quantico." Sarah scrolled through the documents, her mind automatically processing the intelligence with skills she'd thought were permanently dormant. What she read made her stomach tighten with dread. 3 weeks ago, a deep-cover CIA asset embedded in a Russian arms trafficking network had gone silent after reporting the theft of a prototype weapons system. The asset was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a nuclear physicist who'd been feeding intelligence to the agency for 2 years while posing as a freelance weapons consultant. But Elena wasn't just any asset. She was Sarah's former partner from the Prague operation, the one person who knew all the details of how they'd dismantled Victor's network. The operation that had supposedly ended with Elena's death in a bombing meant to kill them both. "She's alive," Sarah whispered, staring at Elena's photograph on the screen. "Very much so," Commander Hayes confirmed. "And according to our intelligence, she's in possession of something that could tip the balance of global power. The Russians want her back, the Chinese are trying to acquire what she has, and 3 different terrorist organizations have put bounties on her head." Sarah continued reading, the pieces of a massive puzzle falling into place. The weapon Elena had reported stolen wasn't conventional ordnance. It was a compact nuclear device with a yield small enough to be easily transported, but large enough to level several city blocks. Worse, it had been modified with technology that made it nearly impossible to detect using standard security measures. "How many people know she's alive?" Sarah asked. "Officially, 5 people in the CIA, 3 in the Pentagon, and the President. Unofficially, Viktor Petrov figured it out 2 days ago, which is why he was so desperate to find you." The helicopter banked sharply, heading toward the military base where Sarah would be briefed on her new mission. But she already understood the basic parameters. Elena was running from everyone, and Sarah was the only person she might trust enough to make contact with. "Where is she now?" "Unknown. She disappeared from her handler's safe house in Berlin 72 hours ago, taking the prototype with her. Since then, we've had confirmed sightings in Prague, Vienna, and Geneva. She's moving fast and staying ahead of multiple pursuit teams, but she won't be able to run forever." Sarah studied Elena's file, noting the updates from their time apart. Her former partner had spent the last 3 years building a reputation as one of the world's foremost experts in miniaturized nuclear technology, consulting for governments and private military contractors while secretly feeding intelligence to the CIA. The perfect deep cover operation until everything went wrong. "What makes you think she'll contact me?" Commander Hayes pulled up another document on the tablet. "Because she already has." The message was brief and coded in a cipher that only Sarah would recognize, a variation on the communication system they'd developed during their partnership. Translated, it read, "The birds are flying south. Meet me where we fed them last. Come alone or not at all." Sarah's breath caught. Elena was referencing their emergency meeting protocol from Prague, modified to account for their current situation. But the location she was suggesting was incredibly dangerous, a public place where either of them could easily be spotted by the multiple intelligence services hunting Elena. "She wants to meet in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City," Sarah said, decoding the final elements of the message. "Tomorrow at noon. Our assessment as well. We'll have a full support team in place, but from a distance. If Elena detects any agency presence, she'll disappear again, and we may never get another chance." The helicopter touched down at Quantico just as the sun was setting. Sarah was escorted to a secure briefing room where she found herself face-to-face with Director Richardson for the first time in 3 years. "Agent Chen," he said, standing as she entered, "you look well. Civilian life agreed with you." "Not anymore," Sarah replied, taking a seat across from him. "I want full operational support and complete autonomy once I'm in the field." Done, but I need to brief you on something that's not in the files. Richardson activated a secure display showing satellite imagery of several major cities. 3 days ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that the stolen device isn't the only one. Alina was part of a team developing at least 6 prototypes, and we have reason to believe others have been compromised. Sarah studied the images, recognizing the tactical significance immediately. Someone's planning coordinated attacks. That's our assessment. The devices are small enough to be smuggled easily, but powerful enough to cause massive casualties and economic disruption. If they detonate simultaneously in major population centers, the psychological impact alone could trigger global instability. The scale of the threat was staggering. Sarah had dealt with terrorists and state actors throughout her career, but this represented something entirely new, the democratization of nuclear terrorism through miniaturized technology. Who's behind it? We're not certain, but the evidence points to a consortium of arms dealers working with rogue elements from multiple intelligence services. Viktor Petrov appears to be involved, but he's not running the operation. Richardson pulled up another file showing intercepts from various international intelligence agencies. The Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, and at least 3 terrorist organizations are all scrambling to acquire these devices. Alina may be the only person who knows where all of them are hidden. Sarah spent the rest of the evening reviewing operational plans and intelligence summaries. The mission parameters were simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. She had to make contact with Alina, gain her trust, and convince her to reveal the locations of the remaining devices before other actors could acquire them. But she also had to do it while evading the multiple teams hunting Alina, without backup, in one of the most surveilled cities in the world. At midnight, she was given new identity documents, mission equipment, and a secure communication device. Her cover would be Isabella Romano, an art historian researching Renaissance architecture in Rome. The legend was solid enough to pass casual inspection, but wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. One more thing, Director Richardson said as she prepared to leave. Alina's handler in Berlin was found dead yesterday morning. Professional execution, probably Russian. She knows they're closing in, which makes her even more dangerous. Sarah absorbed this information without comment. Alina had always been brilliant but unstable, prone to paranoid episodes that made her difficult to manage. If she believed everyone was hunting her, including her own agency, she might do something desperate. The flight to Rome gave Sarah time to prepare mentally for what was coming. She hadn't seen Alina since the night they'd supposedly died together in Prague, and she wasn't sure what to expect from their reunion. The woman who'd been her closest partner and most trusted friend had been living a lie for 3 years, just as Sarah had been. But where Sarah had chosen peaceful anonymity, Alina had dove deeper into the shadow world of international espionage. The question was whether she was still the same person Sarah had known, or if 3 years of living on the edge had changed her into something else entirely. Rome's ancient streets buzzed with their usual mixture of tourists, locals, and street vendors as Sarah made her way toward Vatican City. She'd arrived 12 hours early, giving herself time to conduct surveillance and identify potential threats. What she found was troubling. At least 4 different intelligence teams were already in position around St. Peter's Square. She recognized the tactical signatures of Russian FSB operatives, Chinese Ministry of State security agents, and what appeared to be a joint European Union counterterrorism unit. All of them were waiting for Alina to appear. Sarah established her own observation post in a cafe overlooking the square and settled in to wait. Alina would come, Sarah was certain of that, but she would also be walking into a trap that could trigger an international incident with global implications. As noon approached, Sarah spotted Alina moving through the crowd with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly how dangerous her situation was. She'd changed her appearance dramatically, short dark hair instead of her natural blonde, darker skin tone from careful makeup, and clothing that made her blend perfectly with the Roman locals. But Sarah recognized her immediately. Some things couldn't be disguised. The way Alina moved, the careful way she observed her surroundings, the subtle hand signals she was using to communicate that she'd spotted at least some of the surveillance teams. What Alina didn't know was that Sarah had spotted 2 additional teams that even she had missed. The trap wasn't just closing on Alina, It was about to snap shut on both of them. Sarah stood up from the cafe, made her decision, and walked into the square to save the woman who'd once saved her life. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fates, but the safety of millions of innocent people in cities around the world. The reunion was about to begin, and with it, a race against time to prevent nuclear terrorism on an unprecedented scale. Sarah approached Alina through the crowd of tourists in St. Peter's Square, every sense alert to the dozens of hostile agents closing in around them. The midday sun cast harsh shadows between the ancient columns, creating a maze of light and darkness that could conceal friends or enemies with equal effectiveness. Alina spotted her first, their eyes meeting across 30 feet of crowded stone courtyard. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the two women who'd supposedly died together in Prague 3 years ago found themselves face to face once again. Alina's expression cycled through surprise, relief, and wariness in the space of seconds. Sarah made the first move, walking directly toward Alina while speaking loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Alina, what a wonderful surprise to see you here. How long has it been?" Playing her part, Alina smiled and embraced her former partner. "Sarah, I can't believe it's you. You look fantastic." But during their embrace, Alina whispered urgently in Sarah's ear. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they move. There are at least 6 teams here." "I counted 8, Sarah whispered back. "Follow my lead." They separated, maintaining their act of surprised friends meeting by chance while Sarah's mind raced through escape options. The square was too open, too monitored, too controlled. But she'd spent her morning identifying exactly this kind of situation. "We should get coffee and catch up," Sarah said loudly, linking arms with Alina and steering her toward the northern exit from the square. "I know a lovely place just down the street." They walked casually through the crowd, 2 middle-aged women discussing art and travel, while multiple international intelligence teams debated their next moves. Sarah could feel the weight of surveillance equipment tracking their every step, but she also knew that political considerations would limit how aggressive any of the teams could be in such a public location. The Russian team moved first. 2 FSB operatives began closing in from the east, their approach professionally disguised as tourist behavior but unmistakable to Sarah's trained eye. They would reach interception distance in less than 60 seconds, forcing a confrontation that could turn violent very quickly. "The Russians are moving," Alina muttered. "I see them. Keep walking normally." Sarah guided Alina toward a cluster of tour groups near the Basilica steps, using the cover of organized tourists to mask their change in direction. But as they moved, she spotted the Chinese team repositioning to cut off their northern exit route. "We're boxed in," Alina said, her voice tight with stress. "Not yet. When I give the signal, break left toward the Swiss guards." The Vatican's own security force represented neutral ground that none of the intelligence teams could violate without creating a major international incident. If Sarah and Alina could reach the Swiss guards' perimeter, they would have at least temporary protection. But they never got the chance. The first gunshot shattered the peaceful atmosphere of St. Peter's Square like thunder. Tourists screamed and scattered as someone opened fire from the crowd, the sound echoing off ancient stones with horrifying clarity. Sarah spun toward the source of the gunfire and saw Viktor Petrov advancing through the chaos with a team of mercenaries, his earlier sophisticated approach abandoned in favor of brute force. He'd apparently decided that if he couldn't capture Alina quietly, he would take her by force regardless of the consequences. "This way," Sarah grabbed Alina's arm and ran toward the Basilica steps as bullets whined overhead. The various intelligence teams were engaging each other now, professional surveillance collapsing into open warfare as each faction fought to secure Alina and the information she carried. They reached the steps just as the Swiss guards responded to the gunfire, their traditional ceremonial appearance giving way to modern tactical training. The colorful uniforms concealed professional soldiers armed with contemporary weapons, and they moved with the precision of an elite military unit. "Sanctuary," Alina called out in Italian, claiming the ancient right of protection that the Vatican had honored for centuries. The Swiss guards formed a protective perimeter around them just as Victor's mercenaries reached the steps. For a moment, the two forces faced each other across a few feet of sacred ground, neither willing to be the first to violate Vatican neutrality. Victor himself appeared at the edge of the standoff, his expensive suit torn and bloodied from the fighting in the square. His eyes burned with the fury of a man who'd spent 3 years planning his revenge, only to be thwarted by ancient protocols of diplomatic immunity. "This is not over," he called out to Sarah. "You cannot hide behind church walls forever." But even as he spoke, sirens wailed throughout Rome as Italian police and military units converged on Vatican City. The gunfight had been impossible to contain, and now the international media would be asking questions that none of the intelligence agencies could answer honestly. The Swiss Guard captain, a professional soldier who'd clearly dealt with unusual situations before, escorted Sarah and Alina into the basilica while his men maintained their protective formation. Once inside, they were led through corridors that most tourists never saw, past priceless artwork, and into secure areas where church security intersected with international diplomacy. "You have perhaps 1 hour before diplomatic pressure forces us to release you," the captain informed them in accented English. "I suggest you use that time wisely." Alone in a small conference room beneath St. Peter's Basilica, Sarah and Alina finally had the chance to speak freely for the first time in 3 years. "I thought you were dead," Sarah said. "The explosion in Prague was meant to kill us both," Alina finished. "But I'd spotted the bomb 20 minutes before it detonated. I had just enough time to get clear and make it look like I'd died with you." Alina activated a small electronic device that would prevent their conversation from being recorded, then pulled out a secure tablet showing technical specifications that made Sarah's blood run cold. "This is what they're really after," Alina said, displaying schematics for the miniaturized nuclear devices. "Not just one prototype, but a complete production facility capable of manufacturing dozens of these weapons." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Who's behind it? A consortium of arms dealers working with rogue scientists from multiple countries. They're not trying to sell individual weapons to terrorists. They're planning to auction off the entire production capability to the highest bidder. Alina scrolled through intelligence files showing the scope of the conspiracy. Scientists from Russia, China, North Korea, and Pakistan had been recruited to work on the project. Their expertise combined to create weapons technology that surpassed anything previously developed. "The facility is hidden in a decommissioned mine in the Swiss Alps," Alina continued. "They've been using my research to complete the miniaturization process, and they're ready to begin full-scale production." Sarah studied the technical specifications, understanding enough to recognize the global threat they represented. "How many people know about this?" "Too many. The original team included 12 scientists, but 6 of them have been eliminated to protect operational security. I'm one of the remaining 6, and the others are either in hiding or already captured." Alina pulled up satellite imagery showing the location of the hidden facility. "They're planning to conduct the auction in 72 hours. Representatives from hostile governments and terrorist organizations will bid on exclusive access to the technology." The weight of the situation settled on Sarah's shoulders like lead. They weren't just trying to prevent a terrorist attack. They were trying to prevent the proliferation of nuclear terrorism as a readily available tool for anyone with sufficient funding. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "Help me destroy the facility before the auction takes place. The Swiss location makes it almost impossible for conventional military forces to attack without creating an international incident, but 2 people with the right skills might be able to infiltrate and sabotage the operation." Alina showed Sarah detailed schematics of the facility's security systems, underground layout, and personnel assignments. "I've been planning this for months, but I need someone I trust to help execute it." Sarah studied the plans, her tactical mind automatically identifying weaknesses and opportunities. "This is a suicide mission. Even if we succeed in destroying the facility, we'll never make it out alive." "I know, but if we don't try, these weapons will be manufactured and distributed around the world. Cities will burn, governments will fall, and millions of innocent people will die." Through the conference room's small window, Sarah could see the chaos in St. Peter's Square beginning to subside as various intelligence teams withdrew to regroup. Soon, diplomatic pressure would force the Swiss guards to release them, and the hunt would resume with even greater intensity. "There's something else," Alina said quietly. Viktor Isin Petrov isn't just working for the Russians anymore. He's been hired by the consortium to ensure that I don't interfere with their plans. They know I have the technical knowledge to sabotage their operation, so they want me eliminated. Sarah absorbed this final piece of information, understanding that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Once they left Vatican protection, every intelligence service in Europe would be hunting them, along with Viktor's mercenaries and whatever security forces the consortium had deployed. "When do we leave?" Sarah asked. Elena smiled for the first time since their reunion, the expression transforming her face back into the woman Sarah remembered from Prague. "There's a service tunnel that connects the Vatican to the Roman subway system. We can be in Switzerland by tomorrow morning if we move fast enough." As they prepared to leave the safety of Vatican City for what would likely be their final mission together, Sarah thought about the quiet life she'd built in Millbrook. 3 years of pouring coffee and serving breakfast to people who'd become her family, destroyed in a single morning because her past had finally caught up with her. But as she checked her weapons and reviewed the mission plans, she realized that Agent Sarah Chen had never truly been retired. She'd just been waiting for a mission important enough to justify coming back from the dead. Tomorrow, she and Alina would infiltrate a heavily guarded facility in the Swiss Alps and attempt to prevent nuclear terrorism from becoming a commodity available to the highest bidder. The odds of survival were minimal, but the cost of failure was unthinkable. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt completely alive. Outside their small conference room, the ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the prayers of saints and sinners, the hopes and fears of countless generations. Tonight, they would witness 2 women preparing to sacrifice their lives to save a world that would never know their names. But that was enough. It had to be enough. The mission to end the proliferation of nuclear terrorism was about to begin, and Agent Sarah Chen was finally going home to the shadows where she belonged.